I'm fortunate enough to work in a place where I can borrow the hardware that comes through our doors. So today, I get to share one of my all-time favourite graphics cards with you, NVIDIA's GTX 960. In February of 2014, NVIDIA launched the first cards based on their brand new Maxwell architecture. The ones you'll most remember though being the GTX 750 and its Ti variant, although some 800 series mobile chips and an OEM-only GTX 745 were Maxwell based as well. NVIDIA's main focus here wasn't performance per se, but power efficiency, and boy was the new Maxwell architecture efficient. The 750 Ti topped out at around 60 watts under full load, not even requiring any additional power connectors, all the while regularly edging out AMD's R7 260X in performance, and sometimes completely demolishing it. Fast forward towards the tail end of 2014, and we got our first look at Maxwell's second generation, which brought upgrades such as better color compression, pixel sampling, HDMI 2.0 support, and an updated NV encoder with HEVC encoding support as well. The 970 and 980 were the first Maxwell 2.0 cards we saw, with absolutely nothing negative coming from that at all. Right before all of that blew up though, and I mean literally only a few days before NVIDIA released their statement on the 970's memory configuration, we finally got the GTX 960.
Right, so here it is then. This is the GTX 960. This originally came to us from university. It was used presumably in their games dev kind of department. So it was been for the cards maps. So yeah, it was presumably used in a university computer for its entire life. So I have no reason to believe that it doesn't work, but we're going to try it in a system we've got set up here anyway, just to make sure it's actually working before we actually touch it. Full disclosure, I know it's actually working because I've had to film this. I think this is the third time I've tried to film this in for a bit. So yeah, I actually already know it's working, but I'm going to read through it anyway just so I can show you all that it's actually working. So let's get plugged into the system. And actually plug in the power cable. Unlike the first time I tried to film this and ended up forgetting to plug the power cable in. So you can my cable in. PSU is probably not. So it's sharp pins to get that on. Is that not working? Go. Begin. Yeah. But yeah, like I said, I actually already knew it was working. I just had to refilm this multiple times because of mistakes I kept on making. But yeah, I'll get on the capture card actually. We don't have any drivers installed just now, so it is just showing Microsoft basic display adapter for now, but it doesn't indeed say GM206, which is the die the GTX 960 used. It doesn't show the memory because it's got the drivers just now, but it definitely is 4 gigs because I've actually already checked it. But yeah, for now though, given this graphics card's history, it's presumably never had its thermal paste change, so we're going to do that just now, and then we'll get into the benchmarks.
While we do that though, let's see what we actually have here. This particular 960, EVGA's SSC version, had base and boost clocks of 1279 and 1342 MHz, 13 to 14% higher than from the factory. But this one boosted up even further to between 1430 to 1443 MHz. There's no difference in memory speed though, so it still runs at an effective 7 gigabits per second on the same 128-bit bus. Speaking of memory, and this is one that seemed to hit a nerve with a lot of people on release, The 960 had 2 GB of GDDR5, but some manufacturers released versions with 4 gigs, like this one, which, unlike the 970, is actually a proper 4 gig. Now, a lot of people thought that it was stupid giving the 960 this much memory. The thought being that with settings high enough to need more than 2 gigs, the 960 wouldn't have been fast enough anyway. But as we'll see in the benchmarks, that's not quite true. Before we start trying to run anything on this, we obviously need to get some drivers installed first. Now, I'm assuming Windows would try to do its thing and automatically install some version of the NVIDIA driver, but I think I've disabled that. Either way, I would always install the latest available version anyway. So off to the NVIDIA website I went, and this is one of the few good things about NVIDIA as a company. They actually still support their older graphics cards. I'm looking at you, AMD, who already dropped support for the R9 300 series 2 years ago, even though they came out 9 months after the 900 series. But anyway, the 560.81 drivers were the latest at the time of testing, so that's what we'll be using throughout the tests today. These installed absolutely no problem, which is always a worry when you don't know the history of the card, or if it was even still fully functional when you got it. But with everything seeming to be fully functional, it's time to get into the benchmarks. Before we kick off with the benchmarks though, this I just absolutely had to show people. So I hadn't actually chosen any settings for The Witcher 3 at this point. I just loaded into the save file and it was using the same settings I used the last time I benchmarked the graphics card, which would have been the 1660 Super. And it turned out I used 1080p Ultra settings in that, and yeah, the 960 is doing amazingly well with 1080p Ultra settings. This is the next gen version of the game, by the way, it's not the original. But yeah, we just dipped to 28, 29 FPS there, but the thing that makes this still so playable is the fact that the frame times are dead stable. There's a couple of very minute spikes I can see on the frame time graph on the overlay. I'm not sure if you can see that on the video, but my god is this thing stable, and that's what makes even lower frame rates still playable. Yeah, so back on with the scripted content now. Medium settings increased the average FPS up to around 45 to 55. But honestly, there wasn't any need to reduce the settings. I did it anyway just to see what would happen, but the game was already really stable at Ultra. This is why I feel like 30 FPS and even lower can still be perfectly fine, because if you think back to the PS1 and N64 eras, a lot of games back then were capped at 15 to 20 FPS. It was the stability that made that acceptable. What amazed me almost as much though, as I just saw it in my notes here actually, is that the game wasn't using much VRAM, only about 2.5 gigs, or at least that was what was allocated anyway. So overall, it's great seeing how well optimised the game was originally, still being true today, even after the more demanding next gen update. CS2, even on medium settings at 1080p, ran much better than I expected, especially given my lack of, well, any kind of skill. Despite my struggles though, the game's performance was impressively smooth, with no noticeable issues. We consistently saw frame rates of around 100 to 150 FPS, although that would be your lower or more intense maps like Anubis, but not enough to impact gameplay in any real way. Honestly though, given how much more demanding the game has become since the original CSGO, I underestimated what the 960 could handle. I started with medium settings thinking I might need to dial them back, but it turns out the 960 was more than capable here. There isn't really much to say about GTA 5 to be honest, it just ran really well. Maximum settings at 1080p still had frame rates over 60 FPS throughout the entire test, and I didn't exactly go easy on the 960 here either, rampaging throughout the city for about 10 minutes or so, which is probably about as worst case scenario for performance as you can get in GTA 5, and the 960 just sat there and took it. There might have been one or two very brief hitches, but these had such little impact on performance. You would look at the 0.1% low of 47 FPS and never even know that there were any issues. So overall, the 960, it's a mid-range card from the same year GTA 5 came out on PC, and it just runs it really well. Not so much with Fallout 4 though, to be honest. I think my feelings on this one are a mix of disappointment and a realisation that I probably overestimated what the 960 could do here. I can't actually remember what settings I used back when I had my 960, but I think I had to turn a couple of settings down. But yeah, GTA 5, a game that came out on PC in the same year Fallout 4 did, ran at maximum settings with no issues. Things were actually really good for the most part, in all honesty. I mean, we averaged almost 60 FPS throughout, and frame times were actually quite stable, but every time I ran through some trees, the frame rate would plummet into the low 30s, even the high 20s at times. Now, again, frame rates like that aren't necessarily an issue in themselves, as long as the frame times are consistent, which they were. But when you're running at 70 plus FPS in 1 second, and the frame rate cuts in half the next, just because you ran into some trees, it can just look absolutely awful. The game just really isn't that well balanced at all performance wise, but overall, the 960 did do really well. You just might have to reduce some settings to limit how jarring those performance drops are. Crash Bandicoot's Insane Trilogy could so easily have been perfect, if not for the game's forced use of VSync. I'm thinking it's the same thing that happens in Skyrim actually, where it has a 60 FPS cap, but if you couldn't quite maintain that, VSync would rapidly drop the frame rate to 30 and back, which is what I think was happening when I was playing through some of the late levels in the third game with ultra settings. For the most part though, the 960 barely breaks a sweat. It's just those later levels that drag the frame rate down enough for VSync to start causing issues, which is nothing that dropping the settings couldn't fix. In all honesty though, those levels are just a small part of the game, so it's not actually that big of a problem. It's just the fact that the game runs so well up until that point, it puts such a negative spin on it overall. BenchyTests Drive is a pretty fun sandbox-style, physics-based driving game. I'm assuming most people watching would know that though, so you'll also know just how hard it can be to run as well. But I figured I would go with the high preset anyway, and just see how things go. I think I tried medium settings first actually, because I'm sure I'd done that, and then was surprised how well it ran, so turned them up to high afterwards. But anyway, 960 does really well for the most part here. It only really has trouble on the more intense maps like the jungle ones. The FPS could drop to about the high 30s. That's not terrible, and the frame rate's still stable enough to have fun there, but you might want to turn some settings down to kind of make it a bit more balanced overall, because the other maps, like the one where you throw your car off of the hilltop, ran really well. The frame rate never really drops under 75 FPS there. You'll also need to wait a little bit until you get going on some maps. It just takes some time for all of the textures and that to load in. I think that's more of a game issue though. But yeah, the 960 actually does really well otherwise. So the 960 can't quite do ultra settings in Skyrim Special Edition. Well, it can, it just can't maintain 60 FPS. It can do high settings no problem though. This is actually one of the most stable games I've ever played, which isn't something I thought I would ever be saying about a Bethesda game. But yeah, the frame rate stays dead on the 60 FPS cap and never really drops under that. Never really, it literally doesn't drop under that. Even the 0.1% lows stayed just over 59 FPS. The only thing that actually dropped were the 960's core clocks, and that was because there was so much performance left on the table in the temples and other places indoors that it didn't need to run any faster. So overall, the 960 performs well enough. You actually still have some space on the table to put some of the settings up. but we can obviously overclock the 962. I couldn't actually get much more out of it on the core though, only an extra 75 MHz. I'm not that disappointed with that though, to be honest. I remember my own 960 getting to about the same level, so it makes sense that this one tops out about there too. The memory though, well, the memory just kept on going and going and going and going. It ended up on plus 600 MHz over stock. Now, can't remember what kind of memory overclock mine did back then, so I'm really impressed with how this one does. And please, no one put in the comments whether that's actually a good overclock for memory or not, because I don't want my excitement to be ruined, so please be nice. But yeah, let's go out and try it in a game and see what sort of effect our overclock has. So we're back, having dialed in overclock. Also brewed a fresh coffee because it's kind of getting quite chilly out here. So let's jump into a game and actually test out our overclock. I'm thinking Witcher 3 because in the benchmarks, the frame times for Witcher 3 were really stable, which makes it ideal for testing out our overclock. Because we don't want something that's going to be with the frame rate jumping about all over the place. So let's load back into the same save file that we were using. It's not using the same settings we're using because I changed them to film a little bit, which I'm not sure if I've actually included in the video at this point. So yeah, back using the settings we were using before. It's actually quite a remarkable improvement. Let me get up my notes so I can remember how it actually performed. But yeah, I think this is actually quite a remarkable improvement. 5 to 10 FPS more than what we were getting before. Let me have a quick look on how much power we were using before. Yeah, it's kind of pretty much using the same amount of power as it was before. Pretty much. Well, yeah, maybe about 10 watts more than it was before. Which is to be expected because we are running higher clocks all around here. The voltage I couldn't touch. We might be able to change that with EVGA Precision rather than MSI Afterburner that I used. I'm pretty sure Precision was what I used to overclock the 960 that I originally had a while back now. But yeah, we're generally getting like we're near 60 FPS performance here. Frame times are still really stable. So our memory overclock's obviously holding up pretty well. Normally when the memory's unstable, you'd maybe see the frame times going kind of all over the place. So attack this drowner. That was quite violent. But yeah, I'm quite impressed with how the performance is here. Generally, I'm really impressed with how well the overclock's done. We should end up seeing similar gains in the other games as well. I mean, other than Fallout 4, I'm not sure if at this point if I'm actually going to include the Fallout 4 benchmark in the video because I'm doing quite a few games. So yeah, with Fallout 4, if I didn't include it in the video, I was kind of disappointed, to be honest. Overall performance was really good. Mostly. It was just a few select areas around the lakes of Sanctuary Hills. Can't remember if it's called Sanctuary Hills or not. The Sanctuary, the starting area your player's in. And then around the wooded areas around there, performance could dip just below 30 FPS and appear quite stuttery. But yeah, in general, I'm really impressed with the performance overall of the GTX 960. It's near as makes no difference, a decade old now, and it wasn't obviously a high-end card there. It was a 60 series card. It was mid-range. So the fact that a 10-year-old mid-range card is still offering performance in recent games, a decade after its release, it's astounding, quite frankly. It's no wonder this was my favourite card all those years ago. So, I really enjoyed getting to test the 960 today. It's a card that really meant a lot to me because of what was going on in my life at the time I got it. So it makes me really, really happy to see something that meant so much to me is still doing so good nearly a decade later. It runs a lot of recent and semi-recent games really well still, and uses very little power to do so. I think across every test to date, it only ever pulled around 100 watts at worst. So we're getting a lot of performance for relatively little power draw. Even better if you can get it cheap enough as well. I would probably avoid the 2 gig version that I had though, because most games are going to use more than that. Crash Bandicoot being the only one that didn't. Fallout 4 came close, but that was kind of right on the 2 gig limit. But yeah, let me know what you all thought, and I'm going to sign off for now. Hopefully you enjoyed the video, and hopefully I'll see you in the next one.